still coming in, and so try to find a seat, and we want to get started because we got some outstanding speakers that we want to hear. So glad you came, and I'm seeing people from a lot of different places, and later on in the conference we're going to find out how many states are represented here. A lot of you have come from quite a distance, and we appreciate it. Seen people from Mississippi, Michigan, and Virginia, and a lot of places. So thank you so much for coming. One thing, as you notice, this conference, the title is Navigating Cultural Chaos, and our country is in chaos. And the cultural left is well organized, their agenda is well defined, they are well funded, and they are powerful. And those of us on the right are blinking and say, what's going on? We're kind of like deer caught in the headlights. And the cultural left, their goal is to turn our country into an atheistic country where people like you and I are marginalized, discriminated against, and persecuted for being bigots and religious terrorists. And so we thought as a college this would be a great opportunity to educate our students and educate our friends on what's going on, what the left believes, what they're trying to push, what the Bible teaches, and how we can respond intelligently and effectively and be a little smarter than deer caught in the headlights. So we're so glad that you came. And the cultural left is pushing for PC, political correctness. We are pushing for BC, biblical correctness. And now, our schedule this morning is pretty tight. And so we don't have any breaks scheduled, but some of you will need to take a break to go to the bathroom. Just do it and then come back quietly. One of the problems is when we turn people loose, there's lots of fellowship going on, and it's hard to get everybody back in. And so we're trying to get stuff done. So that's the schedule. The restrooms are in the foyer on that side. And so glad you're here. And this time we're going to open with a word of prayer and a song. I'll ask Reverend Jared Henry, one of our speakers, if he'll lead us in prayer.
Father, we just come before you today and invite your Holy Spirit to be with us, Lord. These are moments, Lord, that we commit our mind to you, our heart to you, our body, our soul, all that we are, Father. We desire to follow you, to hear from you, God. So instruct us, give us ears to hear what you have to say to us, Father, so that we would be a people who go out in the harvest field, recognizing, Lord, that the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. So equip us today, these next couple of days, Lord, and may you be glorified in all that's said and done. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Please stand with us and sing a charge to keep I have on page 536 in your hymnal. A charge I have to keep, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky, to serve the present age. My calling to watch and pray, and on thyself rely, and let me ne'er my trust betray, but press to realms on high.
You may be seated. That is a song we sang at my ordination. And what a charge we do have. We, as church leaders, have a huge responsibility. May we not drop the ball. Well, we're glad to start out our first session with Reverend Tim Throckmorton. He tells me he's a Buckeye. You know, they say, what is a Buckeye? It's a worthless nut. And what makes it worse is that he works for the Family Research Council. He said that his office is between the White House and the Capitol. So we had to hose him down when he came on campus. But he did clean up pretty good for coming out of the swamp. Well, brother, we appreciate you trying to stand for truth in a place that desperately needs it. Being a light in a place that's rather dark. His title is, he is a National Director for Community Impact for the Family Research Council. And so it's a delight to have him. Let's welcome him as he comes to speak.
Thank you, sir. Well, it's good to be with you. It's good to be among holiness folk. I am an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene, and so as I travel around the country talking to leaders, it's not all the time I get to hang out with my people. And it's so good to be with you today, and I am honored by the invitation. I commend Dr. Spies and Dr. Lorimer and the faculty and all those who are doing good work here, shaping lives, shaping worldviews. It's also an honor to be with my good friend Dr. Brian Powell and Reverend Jared Henry. I appreciate their work and the influence they have, the difference they're making generationally. Let's begin. Turn your Bibles with me to Genesis 3. Genesis chapter 3, and we'll read a few verses there as we get going. And I've entitled this, First Things First. First things first. Let's just deal with first things first. And in Genesis 3, this is not a new account, this is an old account, but it's applicable to where we are today. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made, and he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. The woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. The serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die. For God doth know in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes shall be open, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. Now, as I begin my time with you, which really begins our entire event here, let me make a few observations, some important things. My heart's prayer is that we individually live and serve God in this moment that He has entrusted to our stewardship and our ministry. God's handed this moment to us, and that we are fully prepared to do so. I will tell you as a pastor, I pastored for 22 years. And of the things that kept me up at night, one of those was, oh God, are we as a church making disciples that can stand firm in their faith regardless of what they face long after we part? That kept me up. It was something that I thought, Lord, I don't want to fail. We build buildings and we have events and we do all kinds of things in ministry. However, the most important thing, the thing we are called to do and directed to do, is to make disciples. A disciple who can live and understand and follow Jesus. Those people make a difference in the world. Here's where it gets real for the church. Paul in 2 Corinthians, you'll know this passage, as he's looking at confusion that they're dealing with there, that we're dealing with now. He says, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we're not ignorant of his devices, or his schemes, or his treachery. Now, this is in real time. My heart goes out to those who are leading congregations, who are pastoring, leading people, preaching to people who are not prepared to equip those they are serving, who don't understand what's happening around them. They don't understand the culture that they're in, and much of this, they're just as afraid as the folks in the pews are. They're just as uncertain as those who they are leading. And I think of the waves that just move things back and forth on a seashore. It's as if that's what much of the church is doing today. Now, we've never been here. We have never been here. I was on a call earlier this week listening to the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and he was making an observation. And often when gentlemen like that say things like they say, and I think, wow, if they feel this way, this is quite a thing. He said, this is more than big government socialists enacting policy. This is much more than that. Where we are today is different. It's about fundamentally changing our nation. Now, I'm going to talk in what you may see as political terms or governmental terms, and don't dial me out here because I'm talking about where we live and breathe and have our being and where we are doing ministry, so we must understand where we are. I think historical perspective helps us. Margaret Thatcher, he was talking about Margaret Thatcher, and I had forgotten this. Margaret Thatcher, who became the Prime Minister of Great Britain, she served in that capacity from 1979 up to 1990. But in 1975, she became the leader of the Conservative Party in England. And she began pushing back on socialism. She began speaking against it. She began talking about how it lacks in helping people. And she was just stating facts. Often when you just state facts, it makes a difference. So she was just stating fact, but she was relentless in it. She understood it, and she spoke clearly to it. And she literally broke the moral authority of socialism in England. So by the time she got elected, and she kept building, and by the time she finished, the Socialist Party was unacceptable. They were isolated. They were without power. And think about this. For 40 years, at least 40 years, no one from the Labour Party was elected to office as Prime Minister in Great Britain because of her work back in the 70s. Now, I mention that because Christians can make a difference in culture. No, let me rephrase that. Christians must make a difference in culture. We are called to this. And our founders understood completely. Sam Adams, one of our great founders, and a lot of the culture knows him because of beer, but that's not what he's known for. He was an incredibly smart individual, very godly man. He said, how strangely the tools of a tyrant pervert the plain meaning of words. Now, I'm beginning here, and I begin in Genesis 3 for a reason. Because much of what's happening in culture today is built around language. It's built around words. It's built around what people hear. Hear me now. We in America, we live in America. This is America, right? Here in Kentucky, it's America. We live in America. This is different than anywhere else on the face of the earth. Nothing is like this. The freedoms we enjoy here, people don't enjoy around the world. We are blessed by this opportunity. If we were living in Argentina, we'd be having a different conversation. If we were living in China, we would be having a different conversation. But we live in America, where we can do something. Amen. And it begins by understanding. And we are built, think about this, we are built for disagreement and debate. It's not a bad thing to have healthy conversations, to be able to say, I believe this, I believe it firmly, and I believe this, and I believe it firmly. This is how we became a nation, by the way. Great leaders debated ideas and came to a consensus and agreed upon those because they, in our case, were biblical principles. Amen. Our founders understood, and they could debate. They were smart people. Don't let anyone tell you they weren't. We have a lot of smart people today, and I glean from them. Great leaders around the country. I have dear friends who I serve with and work with and speak with. My friend Bill Federer, David Barton, and others. Great authors who paint the picture. Years ago, there was a book by Klaus Skousen called The Naked Communist that really unpacked what was going on in our culture. It was a tough read, and since then many have written new books. And so I have been a student of understanding our history and our culture for many years. And I've learned from great recent authors, and I've mentioned them to some of my dear friends. Erwin Lutzer just wrote a great book that's entitled "We Will Not Be Silenced." There's a great book by Rod Dreyer, "Live Not by Lies," which is a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who lived in a Soviet prison. And then dear friend, the good folks at Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro and others, Michael Knowles wrote a book called Speechless. These are great perspectives on what's happening. So my point is, if we understand what's going on, where it came from, then we're more prepared, better prepared to speak clearly, intelligently, and effectively to what's happening today. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing work. The Family Research Council stands on the shoulders of giants, incredible men. James Dobson in 1983 founded the Family Research Council because he knew that we needed a biblical worldview perspective in our nation's capital, speaking truth to legislative issues, to policy issues, and to leaders who need to hear what a biblical perspective is. Now, I believe the saying that information is oxygen. It helps us live. It helps us live well. I began as a young man. My dad was an old Goldwater Republican back in the year. I didn't grow up in church or around church, but I did understand certain things about government, about civics. And he introduced me to a man by the name of Paul Weyrich back in the 80s. You may or may not know that name. Very conservative voice. He had a line that haunted me. And Weyrich said, this is years ago when I heard it, it haunted me. We are different from previous generations of conservatives, he said. We're no longer working to preserve the status quo. We are radicals, working to overturn the present power structure. In other words, what's infiltrated the nation, leadership-wise, ideologically, we now are on the outside, and we're trying to recapture what was once a great government, and a great society, and a great culture. I remember in the 1990s when we began to pastor, I heard Josh McDowell, first one I ever heard, mention the phrase multiculturalism. And he explained it, and I thought, this is bad. If they get this implemented, this is going to be bad. And then he started talking about tolerance. And I immediately, along with other leaders in church in America, saw it and responded incorrectly. Because I thought this was just something to speak against and it would go away. Little did I know that what he was seeing then and what we are seeing now was a threat that could not be quickly disposed of, but it was the workings of a masterful strategy that had been implemented many years ago, that was effectively being executed over the decades and was coming to fruition as I began my pastoral ministry back in the 1990s. So to a generation of leaders that's here, a new generation of leaders, it's good for you to know who broke your country. How did we get here? Well, this strategy that I'm talking to you about is the new thing. I read it in Genesis 3. We understand it. And you can take what the serpent did, you can take what Eve and Adam did, you can take all of that, and I think you can boil it down to just this one simple thought. Satan got Adam and Eve's eyes off of everything they had. They were blessed. If anybody was ever blessed, Adam and Eve were blessed. I mean, it was Eden. It was gorgeous. Everything, every need was supplied. Satan got their eyes off of what they had onto something they did not need, and would bring them great harm. And it's this bait and switch. It's this same type of diabolical work that's happening in culture today that has taken the eyes of this blessed land off of everything we've enjoyed as a nation onto something that really is going to hurt us if we let it happen. Amen. So let's begin. How did this come our way? It didn't just happen overnight. Our place in world history, as I said, is unique, and we'll talk more about that in other sessions. Our founders were unique. They were well-read. They were biblically centered. We talk a lot, and I will talk a lot about biblical worldview in my time with you. Hear me. You've heard this a lot. Our founders had a biblical worldview, which produced what we are enjoying today, the longest-lasting nation on the face of the earth. Mark chapter 3, verse 25 or 27 says, "No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his good except he first bind the strong man, then he'll spoil his house." You can't take the house until you get the strong man bound up, and you can take advantage of everything else. Once you stop that, then it's free reign. And Satan knows that the greatest adversary to his plans for mankind are Christians. Amen. In America. America's a target. Why is America the target? Hey, look, we're only 4.3% of the world's population. We're of overall population in the world, 4.3%. But from this 4.3% of the world's population comes 40% of the world's wealth. 85 cents of every dollar that goes to missions around the world, 85% of every dollar comes from this country. We have given more money to rebuild infrastructures after wars and after natural disasters than any other nation in the history of the world. We have given more inventions, more things that have been created from the minds of Americans, enjoying freedom here, the internet, the global positioning devices, hairspray, golf tees. It all came from here. Symphonies, incredible inventions, incredible influence. Why? Because God was honored, freedom was given, and where there's liberty, there is this opportunity for great blessing. And this nation has given more blood for the freedom of others on the face of the earth than any other nation in the history of the world. We are blessed. And we're the target. Why are we the target? Because Satan knows if he wants the world, he's got to come through here. Through Kentucky. Through Americans. For what it's worth, you may not realize this, but in the history of mankind, from Genesis till now, everyone that has ever lived in the history of the world, less than 1% of everyone that's ever lived have enjoyed the freedoms we enjoy here in America. So America is a target, but let me go deeper than that. I think God is the target. We've honored God. This little 4.3% of the world's population has honored God. It has propagated the gospel around the world, sent more missionaries, and blessed the world with more things. And so it's the target. It's the aim. It's in the center of it. And what's happening did not happen overnight. These evil strategies I'm describing to you and about to really give you some names and faces to, this did not happen overnight. My friend, your friend, Jim Garlow, who years ago looked at culture in America, he said, from 1833 to 1918, Christianity, and even back before that, was the predominant culture. It was the major influence in our nation. Christianity was influencing at every level. It was highly respected. From 1918 to 1968, it becomes the subdominant culture. And as you move through the time, what I'm going to tell you and describe to you, most of it took place between those years and then began to bloom later after 1968. It was a place where other influences were coming from around the world and rose in prominence. It was a nation, a good nation, but it was changing rapidly in those periods of time. From 1968 to 1988, Christianity, Jim says, became the subdominant culture. There was chaos, moral chaos. There was a turbulent season where there was much fighting and much indecision. Values changed dramatically between 1968 and 1988 in America. And then if you go to 1988, from 1988 to 1998, we became the counterculture. Christianity was no longer predominant. We're a subculture. Now we're a counterculture. Believers are even being looked upon, mocked upon. There were scandals in ministry, and there were things that happened that demeaned the effectiveness of the church in this nation. And so culturally, we moved in our influence, which leads me to 1998. From 1998 to 2008, Jim says we became the antithetical culture. By this time, we've moved to the place where we are totally different from the culture. Our values, our traditions, are the things we hold dear. Things that are sacred to us are not sacred to those around us in culture. And then from 2008 to the present time, we are now the persecuted church in many ways. You say, well, not persecuted. Nobody's putting a gun to our heads. Your values are diametrically opposed to the values of most leaders in states and in our federal government. And President Spies used a line that I never thought I would hear. Christian terrorists? Parents being terrorists in a school board meeting? That was even said. Those values being looked upon, well, let's look at the strategy. Playwright Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Back to Methuselah. And you don't study it here. You shouldn't, maybe. But there's a line in that where he's talking about Genesis 3. Listen to this. Listen, I will tell you a great secret. I'm very subtle. I have thought and thought and thought. I am very willful and must have what I want. I have willed and willed and willed, and I have eaten strange things, stones and apples that you're afraid to eat. I've gone places, in other words, you've never gone. I've thought things you've never thought. You knew that it was wrong, but I went past that. The real line, things that never were. Things that never were true. He's getting people's eyes from all that they have on things they don't need, on things that are nothing, on things that cause great harm. Think about that. Political correctness. It did not spring into existence all at once. This didn't happen overnight. Hear me. You think, well, some idiot started thinking this way, and others started thinking this way. That's not how it happened. It wasn't accidentally foisted upon us. Subtle thinkers have imposed this new speech code on our society over a number of years, decades, trading the fruits of our cultural inheritance for the forbidden fruit of its inversion. Even scholars sympathetic to political correctness acknowledge that this is communistic, if you understand what political correctness actually is. Now, if you go back to Whittaker Chambers, who was a spy, arrested in America and charged with being a spy. He said of communism, he called it this, the great alternative faith of mankind. we've said it, preachers, we've said it many times. There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man. Mankind needs something to believe in. He needs a purpose. He needs something to focus on and to build upon. And so this alternative faith has become embraced and employed, if you will. The communist leader Mao Zedong popularized the notion of political correctness in the official translation, the English translation of his little red book into English in 1966. Western Marxists have introduced it and propagated it. And if you look back to Karl Marx himself, who said in 1843, he called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists. So question everything that looks good, criticize it if you don't like it, and it's in the language, hear me, it's in the language. If you don't understand what's happening, then you will hear things and you will be moved by them in ways you should not be moved. You may capitulate when you should not capitulate. Most of his followers understood that political revolution required cultural upheaval. You got to tear things up before you can rebuild it the way you want it. Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm, Max Horkheimer, others, intellectuals from the Frankfurt School who implemented this ideology in education that, think about this, one professor influences how many students, which influence how many hundreds of students, which influence how many thousand students. Put that over a period of 10, 12, 20, 30, 40 years, and you've got an infiltration of a different ideology that comes from that influence into educational realms, teaching realms, and other realms. There's another name I don't want you to miss, and don't overlook this name. Antonio Gramsci. He was a communist leader in Italy, and they put him in prison, which for him was something he took advantage of, because he wrote, and his writings have been used instrumentally, taking communism, socialism, taking these ideologies, and not just talking about them, but what he did was he built a playbook to implement this in a culture. It wasn't working. We're not winning in Europe. There's no way that physically we can take over and implement this. It doesn't work. So we're going to start doing it a different way. And his writings led to some of the things we're dealing with today. Marcuse and Horkheimer and Eric Fromm, they begin critiquing and transforming society, and they developed an academic discipline which they called critical theory. Well, this was decades ago. Rather than understanding it, they criticized culture, they tore down culture, and when Gramsci came along, he developed this subtle and persuasive mode by which a ruling class controls society. He proposed two strategies. The first is the wars of maneuver. Now, what these developed into and what they became was this direct confrontation with value systems. Somebody says, I'm going to live this way, or I'm going to say this is right when it's not right, or I'm going to do whatever it is, that it's in direct conflict, and we as Christians do the right thing. We speak biblically to it. We attack the danger. We respond to that. I've said this to pastors all around the country. One of our problems is we have been issues-driven for so long, when the enemy has always been infrastructure-driven. We hit the issues, and there's nothing wrong with that. We should speak biblically to what's happening, but that's not always all that needs to be done. Because there's a diabolical plan that what Gramsci decided was, let's not just come with wars of maneuver, but what he called wars of position. Now, this was a little different. While we're focusing on the fire over here, they're infiltrating institutionally in academia, in business, in government over here. And they're raising up that same influence that came down from the Frankfurt School, what they called the long march through the institutions. What they did, they took that and they began to implement it, and that's where Gramsci's strategy came in. They were focusing, while we were focusing elsewhere, they were building an infrastructure so that now you have leaders in positions. By the way, Antonio Gramsci has a American Gramsci Society. It's still here. There's a Communist Party in America. You can do that in America. But there's a Gramsci Society in America. Now, not the current president, but the former president of the Antonio Gramsci Society was a man by the name of Buttigieg. His son now serves in the administration of this president in Washington, D.C. Jerry Falwell had a prophetic line, I call it. He said, the problem with Christians is when they win, they quit. And when they lose, they quit. But what Gramsci developed was this war of maneuver. Okay, we're going to come in and say, everything's wrong, you're doing this wrong, it was never that way, and they would call right, wrong, right, and so forth and so on. And while we're responding to that, they're going in the back door, and they are building up, and they're infiltrating, and they're taking people without a biblical worldview, a worldview that's diametrically opposed to a biblical worldview, and they're inserting them into key places of leadership, and that's part of the strategy. George Orwell, he got this right. He understood this. Big Brother, man, was that on track or not? I laugh all the time when my wife and I talk about, take your pick. In the morning, we're sitting on the front porch and we discuss blue drapes for the dining room, and by that evening, on my social media, I see blue drapes coming up all over the place. Big Brother, old brother, maybe that's what I should say. Huxley, this dystopian totalitarian take that Orwell had was at the same time as all of this was being implemented. Aldous Huxley sensed the same thing happening in a different way. What he looked at and what he foresaw was how that sex and drugs would take center stage in getting the minds of a new generation off of traditional values and long-held values. And so when you fast forward to that time in the 60s, when this upheaval shocked the nation, then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, something else was beginning to take place. The same plan was being implemented. There was what... While we were doing other things, building churches, the efforts of Gramsci were reborn through a man by the name of Rudy Dutschke, who restyled the war of position as this long march through the institutions that I said, and provided cultural hegemony that they needed to enforce their political vision. Now, there is a little understanding here I want you to get. He believed that conservative cultural hegemony, that conservative values, had endowed the oppressed masses with a false consciousness that left them ignorant to their own oppression. So you didn't know, but you were oppressed, and this is who was oppressing you, and this is what's wrong with the country. The second wave feminists of the 1970s attempted to overcome much of what was happening, but here, what I'm getting to is this speech that George H.W. Bush made in Michigan. It was a Michigan State University. And he said, talking about political correctness, he said, the notion of political correctness has ignited controversy across the land. It replaces old prejudice with new ones. In other words, he's recognizing what's happening. He's recognizing how words, how phrases are being used. He's recognizing how culture is being shaped in a way that's not wholesome as it was. And for those who say it's a good thing, it's just another prejudice of some sort or another. Now, it played out very real in his administration, because when he appointed or recommended this man to be a Supreme Court justice during his term, Clarence Thomas faced something that hadn't been faced before. And I don't know if I saw it then. I don't think that I did. Many did. When he was nominated to the Supreme Court, you know the story of all that he faced as he was accused of sexual harassment. But the accusation of Clarence Thomas was only built around what he supposedly said, nothing he did. And for the first time, there was a national platform of saying, you see, your speech can even do things you don't even know it does. You can hurt somebody. You can offend somebody. And so it's taken now to a new level of influence and used to tear down. Political correctness got its second breath, and we saw it back in the 90s and in the 2000s, the war on Christmas. And I'm passing along a number of key pieces, but when the war on Christmas came and everybody said, oh, it's not that big a deal, most of the people who were propagating taking Christ out of Christmas, that's not a big deal, this and that and the other. And then came in the 90s and in the early 2000s where people could go into restrooms. And if you think this doesn't matter, there's a father in Virginia I'd like you to meet, whose daughter just a month or so ago was raped by a boy in a bathroom who dressed like a girl, claiming to be a girl, in a public school in Virginia. And this was his second time doing that. My point being, those who say, it's not that big a deal. It's just nothing to see here. It's like the reporters who said, nothing to see here when everything's on fire. I've really depressed you enough. I can tell you're not as happy as you were when you walked in here. So, but hear me. Look right at my baby blue eyes. If we don't know what has happened, we'll not know how to speak wisely to it. And those who oppose us love us to just clamor and holler and raise our Bibles and say, this is wrong. Well, they don't care when we do that. But when we speak truth, and we understand how this happened, let me tell you how this happened, and let me tell you why it's wrong. There's an old lost art in America of rejecting a premise. Amen. And it doesn't happen because maybe we don't know what to say. And many pastors in America are silent. When I get asked, why don't pastors speak up? I'll say, well, they're afraid. And they say, I know, they're afraid of people leaving. They're afraid of losing money. Maybe, but they're also possibly afraid of not knowing what to say. And when you don't know what to say, you're silent. And silence is often seen as an endorsement. And so when this is happening and the pulpit says nothing, they get their news elsewhere. I've got to hurry. How do we respond? What do we do? What do we do? There is an answer. And I want to give that to you. And I want to give it to you a number of ways throughout our time together. And the first thing is we acknowledge evil. We acknowledge evil. That's something about us that is not totally embraced everywhere else in the culture. We acknowledge there's evil. Because when you acknowledge evil, you also have to acknowledge a few other things. Christopher Benson, an article I read back in 2010, I found this fascinating. He said, why do people fail to acknowledge the reality of evil? He said, my progressive friends lack the vocabulary and world view to define it. Terry Eggleton, he quotes here, said there are at least 3 reasons for the failure of acknowledging evil. First, being a semantic divorce between sin and evil. People don't believe that. 40% of pastors in America don't believe that the devil is real, according to George Barna. The second being a change in the story the West is telling itself. The third is a suspicion about the uses of rhetoric on evil. The first two signal the apatheism, he writes, of our age, while the last signals the culture wars between religious and secular humanists. He goes on. On the whole, postmodern cultures, despite their fascination with ghouls and vampires, it's Halloween, so you know how everybody gets all jacked up on that stuff. Not me. Have little to say of evil. Perhaps this is because the postmodern man or woman, cool, provisional, laid back, and decentered, lacks the depth that true destructiveness requires. For postmodernism, there's nothing really to be redeemed. Salvation, he says, presupposes sinfulness. If you say there's evil, if you acknowledge there's evil, you have to acknowledge there's good. There's a right, there's a wrong. If there's a heaven, there's a hell. And if all of this is true, then there is a God. And you must deal with that. And you must deal with His Son. But if you take that away, you can believe anything you like. So we need to to recognize evil and understand the battle and where it is, and then know and articulate biblical truth winsomely. Know and articulate biblical truth winsomely. G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite authors, he said, the difference between conservatives and progressives whose business it is to go on making mistakes, conservatives who exist to prevent the mistakes from being corrected. It's funnier than that, guys. I'm telling you, that was a funny line. People would rather be comfortable than consistent. Ditch the slogans, I've heard it said. We live in a country where you can say anything, but let me go a little farther than that, saying that we don't all agree that there's absolute free speech. Because some things are wrong and shouldn't be said. Let me give you an example. We as a nation, years ago, would say things during World War II. My grandparents have some of the posters. Loose lips sink ships. You're going to kill somebody if you reveal the secrets of this nation. So don't say anything. That's limiting speech. Yeah. And then when we, Skousen and others, begin to see the effects of communism on our culture over a number of years, begin to really push back on communist rhetoric. There's nothing wrong with saying you shouldn't say that. But if you do that, then you've got to have the right thing to say. If you say something's wrong, then you've got to have the right thing to say. This is the key. And it's spending less time defending the abstracts and things that the rabbits people want you to chase, and use the right to say something substantial. Say something meaningful. Because I will say, for those who are looking for truth, for those who are seeking to understand what's happening in culture, I see this everywhere I go. They welcome a really good argument for biblical truth. They're drawn to that. They want more, and they'll want to have the conversation. But when you just throw things at them, that's wrong, you're going to hell, and that may be true. But winsomely articulate biblical truth in such a way, just like over in Acts chapter 4, when those people looked at Peter and John and the man that was healed standing with them, they could say nothing against it. Because it's true. And truth is arresting. Truth is winsome. If there's a common good, then there's a highest good, and our founders knew that. And we understand that. We were to master the Bible in such a way that we are who God's called us to be. Peter said it this way: sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. Be ready always to give an answer to every man that seeketh. That didn't transpose right there, did it? That sketch you. That sketch you. I have no idea. I just cut and paste normally, so I apologize for that. Yeah, reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. I think the words asketh. My program fixed it for me, it thought. We need to know what to say, and we need to say it well. Understanding the battle, understanding the attack of the enemy. We're not ignorant of his devices. We understand this. In fact, this is nothing new. It's the same strategy he used in Genesis chapter 3. Getting the eyes of those he's created off of all that they have on something they don't need. You can make a difference. You must make a difference. 1814, the British came back to the shores of this great land and decided, we can fix this. We can take over. They landed up north of Washington. They came ashore around Baltimore. They came down through Upper Marlboro into Washington, D.C., and one of the helpers came running into the White House. Dolly Madison had a nice lunch prepared for her husband, President James Madison, and they said that President Madison isn't coming, but the British are, and they'll be here soon. And so they got what they could. The photograph, the portrait of Washington, she gathered that, and they left the White House. The British came in, literally ate the lunch, and burned the White House. And they burned all the capital, and they destroyed the governmental seat of this new fledgling nation, and then they went marching back to Baltimore because the government seat was in Washington, the military seat was in Baltimore, and so they went back and they're going to take Baltimore and sack it next. But on their way back, they passed through Upper Marlboro again, and the people there had picked on them and berated them, and so they snatched the favorite resident of Upper Marlboro. His name was Dr. William Bean, and they took him as a prisoner, and they marched on up to Baltimore. And so the people of Upper Marlboro thought, we need help, and so they immediately hired an attorney. His name was Francis Scott Key. And you can't just go knock on the door of another nation and say, hey, I want to talk to you. To do something like that, you need presidential permission. So they got to the president, and they asked him for someone. He gave Francis Scott Key, Colonel James Skinner, and they went up to Baltimore, and they were going to negotiate the release of Colonel Bean. So they rowed out into the harbor, and in the harbor they began to negotiate the release. In fact, they took letters from British soldiers who talked about what a great leader, a great doctor that Dr. Bean was, and they negotiated his release, and the captain of the ship said, you can't go because we're going to bomb this little fort over here, and so you've got to stay right here where we are. Now, the fort in Baltimore was Fort McHenry. And it's worth noting that it's a star-shaped fort overlooking the harbor. And I want to say this. When you say you can't make a difference, or people think they can't make a difference, the reason the ships couldn't get close to the fort in Baltimore's harbor was because Americans, good people who loved God and loved their country, 22 merchants took their ships and sunk them in the harbor so the fleet from Britain could not get close enough to attack at their normal range. And so they had to lay back quite a bit. And so they knew they were coming. They were ready for them. In fact, Colonel Armistead, the commanding officer at Fort McHenry, knew they were coming as well. And so he hired a little girl named Mary Pickersgill to create a flag that would stand out. He wanted to say to the British, look, you want me? Right here I am. You have no trouble finding me. So he bought 400 yards of wool. She made 15 stars, 2 foot point to point. The flag was 42 feet wide. It was 30 foot tall. And they put it right up there where the British could find them. And so in September the 13th, the flag was ready and the battle began. And so they began to fire these big rockets over into the fort. These bombs that were supposed to burst when they landed, they were blowing up midair. And then they had these little 1,500 these concrete rockets that made a wobbly red arch as they fired them from small ships. And they bombarded the fort, and they bombarded the fort, and everyone was wondering if it was going to make it, if they were going to survive. Because they knew that Washington had been destroyed, and if Britain does this, then it's over. And what Francis Scott Key and company did not know was, as the British in the middle of the night began a land invasion, good people, Americans who loved God and loved their country, went out into the reeds with weapons, and they pushed back the British, and it was middle of the night. They called off the assault. They knew they couldn't take the fort, and they couldn't take the country, and America was saved because of good people who just did something. It was the next morning, as Francis Scott Key stood there on the ship looking out. You know this line. If you know nothing else, you ought to know this line. As he looked, so say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night the flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave, or the land of the free and the home of the brave? Don't miss the last verse. Don't miss the last verse. Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved home and war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace. May this heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just. And this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. God says to us, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Regardless of how bad it gets, God's people can make a difference. God bless you.